Good afternoon, Prasha, and thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. Subject very dear to my heart, the constitutional connections between Ireland and India, and dear to the heart of a lot of people in both countries. It was something that was much more widely understood and much more widely spoken about in my childhood. I don't know why it fell off the radar a little bit. We were very, very proud in Ireland that the Indian constitution was so influenced by the Irish constitution. And I think the understanding of the reasons for that would probably be due a little bit more of a revival and a little bit more awareness, especially with so many constitutional reform questions going through in both countries. Also, we've got to remember that we've about 6 countries redrafting their own constitution at the moment. But let's come back to the start of this story. This is a report from the Irish Press. It's my own newspaper. I'm very proud of it. I was literary and features editor there for many years. And this is what they reported in the run-up to the drafting of the Indian constitution.
India follows Irish lead. India's draft constitution, now under discussion by the Constituent Assembly, has drawn heavily on the Irish constitution and on the constitutions of Australia, Canada, Britain and the United States. Mr. Anga Depuram Appadurai, advisor to the Indian delegation at the United Nations, stated in London yesterday, the document lays down broad fundamental rights, including freedom of religion, speech, language and customs, and particularly aims to give the fullest protection to all minority groups, he said. Dr. Appadurai stated that the new Indian constitution, following the Constitution of Ireland, lays down certain directive principles of the state's social policy, which are not enforceable by any court but are nevertheless fundamental in the governance of the country, and it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. He also mentioned the structure of the second chamber in India's provinces as another in which the Indian document is largely modelled on the Irish constitution. India's Dáil will be the Legislative Assembly, while the Seanad will be the Legislative Council, which, like the Seanad, will be elected from cultural, economic and other panels. United Press.
How did this come about? You have to remember, when you're drawing up a constitution in the late 1940s, there aren't that many models to start with, and certainly there are very few models of countries that had been occupied by the British. The most famous model would be the Americans. They took 11 years to draw up their constitution after they won their War of Independence. Ireland won partial independence in 1922. So it was 15 years before its constitution was drawn up. So it takes a little bit of time to bring the forces together, that people will agree on what the constitution will be. And this would serve as a pretty useful model for India. Ireland, of course, had a constitution before 1937, but the difference is that the constitution of 1922 was not drawn up by the Irish. It was drawn up under duress by the British. But at the same time, it had served the country well. It had put in pretty basic, pretty strong pillars of what became Irish constitutional law, pledged personal rights, religious freedom, and an independent judiciary, all very important questions. Personal rights were important because in the 1920s and 1930s, the issue of the overbearing state, first of all, the sort of imperial, racist, sectarian nature of the old European empires, but the alternative was seen as an overbearing state under communism. So the commitment to personal rights and personal property, which were enshrined in 1937, were already there in 1922. So was religious freedom. Ireland was a much more religious society in 1937. It had been under the British a very deeply sectarian society, as Northern Ireland was till today. The rights of Catholics were subjugated to the rights of the religion of the empire. So the religious freedom issue was already there, but it was enshrined in 1937. And very importantly, the way it was enshrined in 1937, which is sometimes forgotten, was that it named individual religions. Thus, Ireland became the first country to protect the rights of the Jews. That isn't that big a deal in 2022, although it should be no deal at all. But in 1937, it obviously had a very big international subtext. The independent judiciary already in 1922 was more an American ideal than a British ideal. And that was pretty central to the 1922 Constitution and enshrined in 1937. Independent judiciary, big issue, obviously a big issue in Poland at the moment, and indeed in Spain, where allegiance to Madrid is a charge made against the judiciary in the Catalonian constitutional issue. Good work then by the guys in 1922, and there's a centenary aspect to this, because it was just at this time of the year that they sat down and they started working out that constitution. It wasn't put to the people, it was passed by the Dáil and then passed in the English House of Commons. Interesting characters formed that constitution. Michael Collins chaired the first meeting but wasn't present at subsequent meetings. Instead, it was a very interesting journalist, writer, a great affinity with them as a result, and a rather tragic character of the revolution, Darrell Figgs. But the work that they did, Michael Collins wasn't alive to see it out, saw broad fruition December 1922, and it served the country for 15 years. Ireland in 1937 was a very different country from 1922. The country experienced a civil war on a rather abstract issue. It was the idea of whether the English royal family would be direct head of the state or would be external association. Now, that was a very bitter war. The war itself lasted less than a month, around July, August of 1922. The subsequent really difficult stuff that families have still contending with in Ireland happened after that, with assassinations and reprisals, which went on for 2 years. But by 1937, that external association had been achieved. It had been achieved by the Statute of Westminster in 1931. The losing side in the Civil War were now in power, and they wanted to bring in a constitution that made a statement about Ireland. It was drawn up by Irish people, and it was going to reject the conditions that had been laid on Irish democracy by the British Empire. This was going to be something that hadn't happened in 1922. It was a big constitutional moment. Sovereignty was placed back in the hands of the Irish people. On the British side, an important character is this gentleman. Obviously, Irish and Indian people alike taken aback by the devotion that the English have to Winston Churchill. He was voted, I think, a personality of the millennium, and the current English Prime Minister is fond of styling himself in his manner. I think the author Madhusari Mukherjee said that India made Winston Churchill irrational. The same could be said about Ireland. He was not in power in 1937, but he was a huge opponent of the Constitution, as he was of the Statute of Westminster. He had spent part of his childhood in Ireland, had a deeply distaste, if not hatred, of Ireland and the Irish, and was very opposed to the initial treaty negotiations and the negotiations in 1938, which brought the blockade, an economic blockade of Ireland, which caused immense hardship to an end that was imposed by the British. With India, he had actually been out of power until the Second World War, largely because he was so deeply opposed to any constitutional reform in India. Famously, in 1943, he said during the Bengal famine that the starvation of the anyhow underfed Bengalis is less serious than that of the sturdy Greeks, and the Indians were breeding like rabbits. Between 2 and 3 million people died in that famine. The British blockaded it, prevented aid going in. It was their second time around the houses in Bengal. They'd done the same about over 100 years earlier, when 1/3 of the population starved, and the grandfather of Winston Churchill. George Spencer Churchill had expressed similar views during the Irish famine. So in both cases, in the economic policy of De Valera and in the economic policy of Nehru, food security was a pretty important factor in the way they built their society. This gentleman here contributed to it. It was Britain's second major famine in 25 years. I think another 2 million people died in Iran under British rule in the end of the First World War. Under modern rules of definitions, both famines would count as genocide, and they both were instructive to the economic policies of the two countries. Food security, very important for Eamon de Valera's economic policies, and also for Nehru's economic policies, partly because of their experience at the hand of the English and the views of people like Winston Churchill. The architect of the Irish Constitution was Eamon de Valera. Quite interestingly, he excluded the Dáil and the Seanad from the process of drawing it up. It almost became a personal document. He did it to keep some of the vested interests at bay. Most powerful of the vested interests would have been the Catholic Church at the time, and De Valera was being asked to establish the religion as the Church of England is established as the official religion in England. And he managed both to see off that pressure and bring the Catholic Church on board to support it. The way he did it was recognizing the Catholic Church as the majority religion and then naming other religions, including the Jewish religion, very important in 1937. Hindus and Muslims were not named. I'm not sure why the critical mass of numbers were not there, but it would have been no harm when you're naming religions to have taken the major world religions there as well. How did that impact on society? It meant that separate schooling was now protected. In most countries in the world, if you want a religious schooling, you go private. In Ireland, the state committed to funding schools which were a single religion. And this was very important in protecting the major Protestant schools, Celbridge, Kilkenny, King's Hospital, Alex, Wesley, and the Jewish school. And since then, funding has been made available to Muslim schools. And so to India, Bhimrao Ambedkar is recognized as the father of the constitution in India. And there was a major consultation process. Where did they look? They looked to America, they looked to Ireland, and they looked to Britain. Benegal Narsingh Rao was the emissary. The British minister was too busy to meet him, but he got valuable advice both in America and in Ireland. Famously, Justice Felix Frankfurter of the American Supreme Court advised him against the inclusion of a clause for due process in the Indian Constitution because he thought it would impose an undue burden on the judiciary. It's something that flies in the face of most constitutional principles that are still practiced in America. He then came to Dublin and had his discussions with Eamon de Valera. A lot of the correspondence has been released since it wasn't publicly available at the time. One of the interesting insights from de Valera is that he regretted putting proportional representation, ranked voting into the Constitution. Obviously, it's one of the most beloved features of the Irish electoral process, but de Valera saw as early as the late 1940s that it made it difficult for a single party to achieve the absolute majority that a lot of people felt was important for good governance. India was looking at the issues of religious freedom and the issue of language as well, because de Valera had told Nehru separately that the Irish were finding it very difficult to learn Irish. Converting Ireland into an Irish-speaking society was pretty much had been abandoned even by the late 1940s. It was part of the dream of the revolution of 1922, but obviously not enough of them to carry it through. I think between the great English-speaking society of Britain and America, it was not going to succeed. I had a discussion with this about this with Chaim Herzog, the late Israeli president, whose father had been a rabbi, chief rabbi in Ireland, and a friend of De Valera's, and indeed provided De Valera with a safe house during the revolution. His son is the current president of Israel. Chaim Herzog said that the revival of Hebrew, he looked at what had happened with Irish, and he thought the revival of Irish was never possible because popular culture was so embedded in English and so influenced by both America and Britain. India put 22 recognized languages in the Constitution in the same way as we had put the religions in, and they guaranteed the right to religious freedom, understanding that the context was quite different from what was available in a constitution such as the American and the Swiss, and indeed the Soviet Union Constitution. De Valera would never admit that the Constitution was going to be a transformational document, transforming society. But you can pick up within the clauses within it that it was rejecting the hierarchical, stratified society that had been left behind by the empire. It didn't mention Catholic teaching at all, but the Catholic teaching was no different from the other major Christian religions at the time. It placed the family at the heart of society. This is something you hear from conservative forces and conservative parties around the world to this day. The phrase family values is used a lot. The family at the heart of the Irish Constitution was sometimes seen as an impediment to the sovereign will of the people, and reforms in education and particularly in health. And this exploded in 1949 when the health minister, Noel Browne, was impeded in his attempt to bring in a national health service to Ireland. One important aspect of the Constitution, looking for almost a third way between capitalism and communism, and to avoid the factionalism of deeply divided political positions, which had blighted Ireland in the 1920s and indeed can be seen in America today. Panels of experts elected to the Senate. So you would have this elected meritocracy, where people who would bring their expertise on issues like agriculture to the Senate all fell apart because it became a political process. Reform of the Senate, a lot of the debate is driven by the fact that the original concept of the Senate never really worked. Constitutions are largely, if not completely, about identity. That's what Ireland achieved in 1937, and indeed India achieved. So in a way, we set a twin example to a lot of the countries that were breaking free from empires, not just the British, but the French and the other countries like the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish that had the remains of their old empires. All of that happened very rapidly in the 20-year period after India won its independence. And indeed, the fact that it was achieved through revolution in both cases, it contributed to that emphasis on identity. Countries like China and Romania and Cuba, and Vietnam, Panama, Iran, Nepal, all of their constitutions make direct references to the revolution that has gone before. Interesting to get to look at some of the academic reactions. Leo Cohn, who was involved in drafting the Israeli constitution, did a major thesis on the Free State Constitution of 1922. He described it as the theoretical postulates of a revolutionary upheaval rather than the legislative crystallization of an organic development. Now, I hear you ask, what happened to the Israeli Constitution? Lots of discussions at the same time as going through, and lots of references to the Irish Constitution in 1937, particularly interested in the issue of religious freedom and the fact that Ireland recognized the special position of the Catholic Church without giving it any status, any legal status. So the Israelis particularly interested in that position. There was so much disagreement, the Constitution never got implemented. Obviously, every time anyone expresses an opinion on Israel, it can lead to great debate and trouble. But my very strong opinion is if the Israelis had implemented a constitution similar to the Irish and Indian positions, it would have done more to protect the rights of Palestinians and to prevent more autocratic elements in Israeli society, like we saw from Bibi Netanyahu, causing so much discomfiture to their own citizens and, more importantly, to the Palestinians. Kazan saying the purpose behind the Irish Constitution of 1937 was to consolidate rather than to experiment and start anew. In 1922, it followed the rituals of a new beginning, but there was no constitutional moment. There was no radical change. Instead, the Free State's constitutional order was gradually reduced to the basic structure of the Westminster system. Of course, it was not just De Valera and the 1937 Constitution that made India's constitution happen. It was what De Valera triggered in 1930. Remember what Britain was going through. There was a crisis in the royal family, and the legitimacy of the sovereign was questioned by the marriage of the short reigning king, Edward VIII, and George V was brought in. So in that context, De Valera used the opportunity to move from the position that the winning side of the Civil War had maintained to something that he had been fighting for in his Civil War, which was external association. Ireland wasn't removed from the Commonwealth in 1937. That came later with the Declaration of the Republic in Canada in 1949. But the Indian experience of remaining in the Commonwealth was probably facilitated by the fact that Ireland shown up a model of how it worked. And while India toyed with the idea of breaking the connection completely with Britain, it made it more acceptable to retain the ties through the Commonwealth, which are still there today. Ambedkar was a hugely influential figure in India and I think belatedly recognized internationally. But he made it first and foremost a social document. The Constitution could have ended up being many things, but using the Irish model, put the principles of what sort of society, the new society that India would be, that industrialization and agricultural growth would enhance the economy, and that the caste system should be dismantled, obviously on moral grounds, but also because dividing laborers and creating hierarchical structures was bad economics. It impeded movement of labor, it stopped investment, and it prevented society functioning at an economic as well as a social level. For Ambedkar, it was a personal experience. He was a Dalit himself, and putting this man in charge of redrafting the Constitution, it's quite clear the intent of the newly independent India was to transform their society. Ambedkar's most famous work, Waiting for a Visa, describes his childhood, where he couldn't drink water at school. It had to be poured from a height by the peon. And if there was no peon, there was no water. It's a seminal document. It should be required reading for everyone who tries to have an opinion on hierarchical society and the immigrations of gender and immigration, all of those. The lesson from India, putting Ambedkar in charge of writing the Constitution, should be well learned by the countries drawing up constitutions at the moment. Tunisia going to the polls in July, Egypt going through its 3 constitutions in 10 years, Libya, Syria, both undergoing new constitutions. Put the person who has suffered under the old regime in charge. In a way, that's what happened in Ireland as well. De Valera was Catholic, and Catholics had been discriminated against under the colonial regime and prevented from achieving status and political or economic power. But more importantly, he was not from the entitled status generation. He had affinity with the small farmers and the blue-collar workers of the cities. That was his support group. He's the guy who got to define what kind of a country Ireland would become. And we've seen Ireland prosper and grow under the values of that constitution in the same way that Ambedkar, the Dalit, and Rao, the Brahmin, redrafted the Indian constitution as a statement of what kind of country India would become and how robust the society they constructed would come when the vested interests tried to tear it apart, as happened in both countries. Thank you very much, Prashant. I'd be very happy to take questions.